a prophet ahead of his time. He is a man who has given us guidance, is a man who has given us the steel by which we can go forward. He has railed the halls of Congress with the proper words, often before its time, and nurtured it through its time of passage. He has befriended and railed politicians wherever the occasion was appropriate to make sure that the suitable legislation got through. We have an ESOP today because of Louis Kelso. I'm deeply grateful to him, as I know all of our employees are. To a man who has so many credentials that it will be centuries before we will acknowledge the true moment that has happened here with Louis Kelso's guiding light. But with that, I can say no more that would properly amplify what Louis is, except to hear his words. Louis, and to your lovely wife, Patricia, we're all deeply grateful for what you bring us.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here. It's been a wonderful party so far. I think Charlie and your colleagues, Warren, and Louis Granades, Barbara, and the entire ESOP staff, ESOP Association staff, are to be congratulated on just doing a superb job of bringing us together and making it useful, communication-wise, and fun. Congratulations on it all. The use of ESOPs to save America from the corporate slave trade is the thing I'd like to talk to you about today. Back in feudal times, working people were enfeoffed to the land, attached to the land. And when an estate was transferred, bought or sold, or lost in a crap game by the Duke to some of the neighbors, the people went along with the cattle and the equipment and the whole cheese. That is not unlike what goes on today. Esmark, which could be bought by its 100,000 employees, or Carter Hawley Hale, which could be bought by its 56,000 employees, because those can be financed where ESOPs are used, are being transferred to a single stockholder. And the stock ownership is being compressed, and the employees are being lugged along in a form of economic slavery. There are two kinds of leveraged buyouts, and while up to this point the press treats them as though they were all leveraged buyouts, there's an enormous difference between the two types. The ESOP is democratic. The plutocratic, non-ESOP leveraged buyout is its opposite in every sense except that there's a buyout. The ratio of plutocratic buyouts to democratic buyouts today is about 20 to 1. And that is a blotch on the American scutcheon. It means that we are moving towards fascism in the United States. That's what it means. Just as the state ownership of the means of production is the perfect economic foundation for a communist society, the ownership of the means of production in an industrial state by the rich and by their institutions is the perfect platform for a fascist state. Now, don't understand me as saying that anyone has fascist aspirations. I'm just saying that if the platform for a fascist state is there, somebody's going to see that it happens. And we don't have any time to waste. In the plutocratic leveraged buyout, a handful of key managers, just the necessary number, together with a group of investors, plutocrats if you wish, people who own more money than they can use, so they got to play games with it, become the buyers. And the employees, of course, are traded like slaves in feudal days. No rank and file employees become owners. No middle management becomes owners. And only a handful of top management become owners in the plutocratic buyout. In the democratic ESOP buyout, something radically different takes place. The evil in American society is that its capital ownership is too concentrated. Let me see if I can paint the picture this way. In 1776, the year of the twin revolutions, the American political revolution, the beginning of the industrial revolution, the real event that had happened, but historians without two-factor economics can't put their finger on, can't identify. The real event that happened was that our founding fathers introduced political democracy into a society that was already an economic democracy. Labor provided 95% of the productive input into the manufacture of goods and services and the conduct of trade. Nature, being not in the least bit stupid, arranged democratic diffusion of economic power. One man, one woman, one labor power. Different in quality, different in intensity, but everybody had some. In the 207 years between 1776 and today, the way, to use a Toynbee phrase, the way in which goods and services are produced has been changed. Today, 90% of the productive input comes from capital, not from labor. Rand Corporation did a study a few years ago and said 98%. So I think my figures are very conservative. But one thing hasn't changed. Benjamin Franklin estimated that 95% of the people in colonial days owned no capital. 5% of the people owned it all. Well, every study conducted in the United States since 1932 shows exactly the same thing. 5% of the people own all of the productive power, all of the capital productive power in the American economy. There's one slight difference. Capital is 10,000 times more productive today than it was at the time of the signing of the Constitution, say, in 1789. Today we are no longer a democracy. No matter what we think, one man, one vote ain't democracy. It's only democratic as to political power. We are a political democracy inside an economic plutocracy. I think the only feasible way to look at social power, I'm talking about power that can be administered in a social context, without police, without soldiers, without violence, without fraud. The only way to look at social power is that political power and economic power are equal. Political power is the power to make, interpret, administer, and enforce the laws. And democracy, political democracy, is participation in that process to a degree that makes everyone feel they have a voice and have a part. But economic democracy is the power to produce, economic power is the power to produce goods and services. And if 90% of the productive input comes from capital, and 5% of the people own it all, we are not an economic democracy. The significance of that is, of course, that we make the economy work by redistribution, by coerced trickle-down, by taxation to redistribute income. 55% of U.S. taxes are levied on people who earn income to give it to people who need income. At the state level, it's 60%. Karl Marx would cheer with joy if he realized how totally we have moved toward fulfillment of his prediction. Capitalism will destroy itself. It contains the seeds of its own destruction. By the way, he didn't understand why. He just made a very hopeful guess. But we understand why. And there's something we can do about it, providing we start speaking up and exercising our political power to regain the economic democracy that we had at the beginning. It isn't something new, it's something old that has to be brought back. Let me throw some light on what the magnitudes of these are. Forbes magazine, that is not exactly a haven of democratic economics. Forbes parades the Forbes 400, that is the 400 families whom he counts as having $200 million each or more, as among the American heroes. I mean, why celebrate them if they aren't heroes? I say the plutocrats are the villains, and the kind of celebration that's going to come for them if we don't change isn't going to be what Mr. Forbes has in mind. In their December 19, 1983 issue, Forbes made a survey of 36 leveraged buyouts from 1978 to that date. Of these, 20 were corporations, 16 were divisions, as corporate divisions of corporations. In 31, the top managers and the money lenders, money suppliers, acquired equity in $6.75 billion of assets. Now, what they did is concentrate a narrow ownership, narrow in the sense that it's all owned in the top 5%. They concentrated it with another enormous compression. In those cases, in that $6.75 billion of transfer of assets, rank and file acquired no ownership. They continued to be totally slaves, wage slaves. Middle management got nothing, bought nothing. Most managers piece. Big for them, but small in the whole picture. In 5 out of 36, 4 of which were of our design, 1 was a hybrid, the employees got 75% of the stock. And the stock, the key motivation stock given in addition to the ESOP stock, I shouldn't say given, sold to key management people, and a certain amount of incentive stock given to lenders, was designed so that in a few years it will all come back into the ESOP. The ESOP becomes, in that case, the only logical market for the stock, and the only one in which you can get the true value of it anyway. The public stock markets don't give you true values. I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, what causes the leveraged buyout in the first place? Well, it's easy to see. Most of them are public corporations, of course. And they're not really owned by investors, so that's a euphemistic name given them by Wall Street. They're owned by gamblers, speculators. And the reason for that is that the stock is bought with a view to selling it and is sold with a view to buying other stock. That's not the kind of an investor that you have in employees through an ESOP, where the employee's interest in the corporation is permanent, abiding, in good times and in bad. But they are true investors. Even pension funds, and of course profit-sharing funds, are not investors. Although the public, particularly labor unions, I'm sorry to say, are inclined, and I think misled, to associate pensions with secure investments. Remember, these funds, pensions and profit-sharing plans, buy only low-yield second-hand investments, on which the yield averages about 6%. Sure, if you've got a really wise fund manager on capital gains, you can get it up above that. But remember, capital gain racket is a zero-sum game. The number of winners is exactly equal to the number of losers, less what the croupiers take out. And they're the only ones who win year in, year in, year out. Wall Street runs on commissions. It doesn't run on anything else. So pensions are really not for employees. The employee gets a yield that is below the rate of inflation in about 18 of the last 20 years. They're operated for the churners, the brokers, the churners, who turn over a typical pension fund 95% per year. They do it 200%. If it didn't get so bad, the SEC would step in and do something. Pensions and profit-sharing plans turn those hard-to-earn labor workers' dollars into dead-end gambling chips. Wall Street would have you believe that it finances the growth of the economy. Well, it's financed about 5% over the last 20 years. And most of that was involuntary. That is to say, it's public utility financing under a regulatory system that requires a certain amount of equity stock to be issued to synchronize it with publicly held debt. The democratic ESOP, on the other hand, is a device that is far more powerful than appears on its surface at all. And I urge you all to study this aspect of it. The ESOP operates on pre-tax dollars. Now, is that a bad thing? Is that a government subsidy? Subsidy my eyeball. The Constitution of the United States assures citizens of the rights to unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The right to life implies, absolutely implies, the right to earn a living. And if the way in which goods and services are produced changes from labor-intensive to capital-intensive, and you don't own capital, you're not living on your earnings. And fewer people live on them every day. When a labor union goes to the employer and demands more and more pay for less and less work, they're not asking for wages. They're asking for welfare disguised as wages. That's more true of management than it is of the rank and file. Because whatever labor gets, management multiplies it by 4 or 5 and takes the same thing. Without any argument, by the way. Who is there to argue? Certainly not stockholders. Democratic ESOPs are a step in the direction of democratizing economic power, returning us to the pristine innocence and power diffusion that we had in a pre-industrial society. No thanks to any human institutions, but simply thanks to nature with a capital N. But God had to rely on man to do something. He can't come around and tell us how to run our corporations or how to finance our growth. He gave us an example. He gave us creative power so we could create the tools that diminish the importance of employment. That was their purpose, by the way. People invented tools to get out of toil. No mystery about that. But you can't abolish labor and save it too. What you have to do is learn to become a capital worker. One who works through his privately owned capital, which is employed in production, to supplement your being a labor worker. And sometime way downstream, we'll all be capital workers and there won't be too many labor workers. Or we won't be labor workers too much of our lives. But we're going to all be productive, and we're going to produce goods and services in the way in which the current state of technology permits. Not only is the right to life denied if you don't have effective access to the ownership of capital, your liberty is denied because without economic power, your political power is useless. And by the way, if you had to do without one or the other, you would be better to do without political power. Because as you can find out around this town, you can buy political power if you got enough economic power. That's why economic power has to be widely distributed, universally distributed. But finally, what plutocratic LBOs and the concentration of capital ownership generally does is deny every citizen his pursuit of happiness. The pursuit of happiness phrase is an economic phrase in the Declaration of Independence. In fact, it was interchangeable. There was a big dispute as to which should be put in, and it was not thought to be a very large difference. The original phrasing, which came out of 6 of the colonial charters, was the right to life, liberty, and property. Pursuit of happiness is a substitute for the property phrase. What plutocracy forces most citizens, 95% of citizens, to do is to pursue happiness by a pre-industrial method. That's a denial of your constitutional rights. And by the way, you don't need any legislation to do anything about that. Those provisions of the Constitution are self-actuating, as are the others that relate, namely, equal protection of the laws. The ESOP is a credit mechanism. Not many people think of it as that. We had to smuggle it into the employee benefit sections of the Internal Revenue Code in order to not make it look like something new and different. But I tell you what it is, it's a credit mechanism. It is a device that gives employees access to credit to buy company stock and to pay for it in pre-tax dollars out of what the assets underneath that stock yield. Capital is a self-financing thing, always has been. The question only was, who takes the risk of feasibility that it might not be self-financing? Well, that risk has to be commercially insured, and through the ESOP is one way of having it commercially insured by the corporation that has more to gain from it than anyone else, even more than the employee, because it can use it 3 or 4 times over. That's the simul-financing aspect, by the way, and think of it in these terms. Supposing a corporation wants to expand $1 million. If it finances conventionally, the $1 million will buy it about $500,000 of assets, because you've got to go through the tax ringer. You've got to go through state and federal corporate income tax, and you've got to pay, while you're doing that, the employer's share of Social Security, which is another tax, a redistributive tax. If you want $1 million worth of assets, which was the premise I started out on, you got to commit $2 million worth of corporate income. So let's take $2 million to do that. Conventionally, no change in ownership, $2 million will get you $1 million worth of assets. Let's finance the $2 million expansion through an ESOP. What does it do for you? Buy you $2 million worth of assets. Save you $2 million in taxes. That's 4. Build $2 million worth of ownership into your employees. That's 6. Save you a possible another $2 million in investment in dead-end, second-hand securities, because you would be doing something for retirement, at least if your employees put the pressure on you, you would. So you're up to 8. And when you consider the employee tax saving advantages, you can get as much as 900% greater efficiency out of an ESOP. Its real virtues are still not fully celebrated, but they work. There's a power struggle going on in the United States today. And it's between individual human beings, the citizens, and the plutocratic power lords, and the would-be plutocratic power lords. Top managers who are willing to go for non-ESOP leverage buyouts in order that they get rich, while the impoverishment of the employees is assured for a decade. Because when the typical corporation goes through a non-ESOP leverage buyout, it takes on a burden of debt which it'll take it a decade to get off before it could actually consider an ESOP again. The front line in this engagement is in the democratic ESOP buyout. Why? It is all good. It puts ownership in those who are the natural stockholders. They may not be the only natural stockholders, but they are the most important natural stockholders. The people who work in the company itself. It's a very prominent financial newspaper in the United States that recently went through a recapitalization to protect itself against a leveraged buyout by anyone. Remember now, the morbid capital accumulations in the world are getting to be so great that absolutely nothing is safe. General Motors could be taken over. I'm not talking about General Motors. I'm talking about a famous financial publication. It went through this recapitalization in order to do what? To protect the control of that enterprise and ownership of it by one family. One family. That company has $2 billion working for it, and that $2 billion is mostly working for one family. You want to screw up an economy, a market economy, that's it. There's no better way to do it. You put that enormous earning power into people who can't use it. Adam Smith said again and again, the purpose of production is consumption. Consumption by whom? Anybody? Well, if we all turn philanthropists, real philanthropists, instead of tax-saving philanthropists, that might be true. That's what Marx was looking for. He said through the dictatorship of the proletariat, we'd all become philanthropists. We would all have an exact scientific evaluation of need. Everybody would get just what he needs. Every once in a while I see a bigwig out of Russia and I ask him, how's greed coming along these days? What's the dictatorship of the proletariat doing to greed over there? And I get a lot of hate, but of course it's nonsense. If man could lose his greed, he couldn't have climbed out of the Proterozoic slime 1 trillion years ago. The one thing the human beings are designed not to be able to control is their greed. And that's, by the way, I'm sure what Lincoln had in mind when he said, and the purpose of government is to do for people what they can't do for themselves. Someone's trying to tell me something. Lincoln said, in essence, what John Stuart Mill said in his famous essay on liberty. Purpose of government, the only basis on which government is justified in interfering with the affairs of people is to keep them from hurting each other. Well, when anyone seeks to own productive power that they cannot use for consumption or won't use for consumption, I mean, it's a free country, you ought to pick your own lifestyle. But when you do that and then you seek more productive power, you're trying to beggar your neighbor. With one exception. With one exception. If you can figure out how to take it with you, then perhaps you ought to get a hell of a lot while you're here. But until somebody does that, beggaring your neighbor is the equivalent of mass murder. Economists over the past 50 years have beguiled us into believing that economic power is democratically distributed if we have full employment. That's a national economic policy. Well, the facts are that that once was true because labor provided 90% of the input, 95% of the input into the production of goods and services. But I can assure you, today, that's not true. When capital provides not less than 90% of the input, and as I say, Rand Corporation said 98%. And we have to run this show on redistribution with plutocratic buyouts, great merchandisers like Carter Hawley Hale, engaged in operating some of the fanciest merchandising stores in the land. Don't put any of the ownership into their 56,000 employees, even though it would save them a few billion to do it. Save them a few billion. They squeeze and compress the ownership into a smaller and smaller ball by buying back their stock. They bought back over half of it already, although the SEC is having a contest with them over that. The SEC isn't sure why, incidentally. I was down there the other day telling them why they should. They did listen. I don't know what will come out of it. Anyway, here you have the great kings of merchandising not giving a hoot where the consumers get the money to buy, how they earn the money to buy, and knowing, if they know anything, that they got to get it through redistribution. More and more taxation, more and more federal deficits, more and more debt that's permanent debt. You know, if the economy doesn't work on income, then it can work on loans. Only difficulty is the loans don't get paid off. More and more your debt gets to be permanent, final debt. The first debts to be unpaid are the international ones. Well, that's going on right now. Nobody will pay back $90 billion debt from Mexico or Argentina or Brazil. Those are frozen. They'll be rolled over. The head of the World Bank's working very hard in Congress to unload the bank's losses on the taxpayers. And if we aren't sharp, they'll do it. Keep your eyes open. The next debts that are permanent are the national debt. Does anybody think we're going to pay off the national debt? If you want to really see high legislative comedy, sit around in the galleries of Congress when they're annually increasing the, sometimes they do this twice a year, increasing the debt limit. And I guess it's off record. But some of the cracks are really wonderful. I mean, they do know that it's a hoax. They can't control it. And they can't because the earning power isn't where the needs and wants are. You know, how can you control that? American people are extremely docile, considering what the hell they're faced with. But they're not so docile. They're going to sit around and starve while we have adequate resources, adequate know-how, adequate manpower to produce general affluence. I mean, why we don't squeal louder than we squeal has always been a mystery to me. And of course, the next level of unpayable debts is the annual budget. And the president was elected with a lot of support from the people on the ground that he was going to balance the budget in 3 years. He'd be lucky if he doesn't treble it between now and the next year. There's no way to reduce that and not cut off so much redistribution that everybody wants to wring his neck. The long-term implications of the choice between democratic financing of growth, democratic leveraged buyouts to change plutocratic ownership into democratic ownership is finally a choice of freedom versus general slavery for all citizens. There's no such thing as a benevolent dictatorship. And the plutocratic ownership of economic power leads to leads to plutocratic fascism. Be hopeful. What we've seen here at this conference indicates that we can do it. The ESOP is one of 8 tools, almost every one of which is as powerful as the ESOP. Before the democratic capitalist revolution of returning America to economic democracy is completed, there will be no publicly owned capital instruments at all. No buildings, no schools, no colleges, no subways, no sidewalks, no streets. Only facilities corporation owned broadly by citizens, many of whom will be the public employees who work in them. The facilities, and it will be a second income. They will be capital workers as they are administrative workers and whatever. The facilities corporations will lease the assets to the operating entity. If it's a state university, the facility corporation will lease the university to the state. We can't afford, because of the logic of a market economy, to have assets tied up, sterilized in public ownership. Perhaps that's one